Welcome everyone to part 2 of Module 8, Shoulda, Woulda, Coulda. In part 1, we locked in on the requirement and the use of the word shall to formally and correctly denote a requirement in our technical specs and documents. We do not use must, and we certainly do not use will for our requirements. If there is any confusion on any of this, I suggest you go back and take another quick look at part 1. Now, alongside requirements, the super important mandatory stuff, we also make recommendations in our project basis for design, our standards, and our specifications. But what exactly is a recommendation? Here is a definition from Google. A recommendation is a suggestion or a proposal. It is not a requirement. And given that recommendations are so completely different to requirements, it goes without saying that we must use a different term to distinguish recommendations from requirements. Thankfully, there is a near universal naming convention you can use, the same one used in ISO, API, IEC, NASA, you name it. We are all using the same term to denote a recommendation, and that word is should. Which of the following is a valid definition for the term should? The first definition shown here is ISO's definition. The second one is the one used by API, and the third is a definition used by NASA. So the correct answer is indeed 4, all of the above. So, where a requirement is a contractual obligation, a recommendation is just a proposal. There are no obligations, moral or otherwise, attached to a technical recommendation. There aren't even any obligations on the receiver of the recommendation to inform you if they choose to ignore your recommendation, even if you think it is the right thing to do, even if it is the thing you would do if you were responsible for executing the work. And that's why it is really important that you use recommendations sparingly. Anything more than a handful, and you are potentially setting yourself up for confusion and disappointment on your project. Why do we say that? Let's imagine you are writing a specification for a package that will go out to multiple vendors in a competitive bidding process. If your specification has a large number of recommendations and you have not implemented a process to track how the vendor is actually handling those recommendations, how do you know what you are actually getting for your money? What is your $10 million, or for that matter, $10 billion, actually buying you? We think this is a really serious issue in our industry as we have some critical standards that are packed full of recommendations. And as a result, we have specifications going out to the market that are also packed full of recommendations. Now, who is deciding which recommendations actually get implemented? We'll ask again, what are you actually going to get for your money? And let's not be naive. There are companies we use on pay-by-the-hour contracts that absolutely love all these should statements, as it means many, many more chargeable hours. For example, the contractor should do a full life cycle cost analysis. And the opposite is also true. On a lump sum contract, these recommendations will be treated as extras that will only drive up the price, so best to ignore them all. For example, the package unit should use valves with ANSI leakage class 4. Who will win the bid? The supplier treating the should as requirements, or the one who considers them nice to have? Now, we have spoken to engineers from different industries over the last several months, and the 2 best practices that we have picked up are as follows. Firstly, be wary on the overuse of should statements. Only use a small handful. And secondly, put a process in place that tracks which recommendations will be actually implemented and which ones will be ignored. At least that way you know what you're going to get, especially important when comparing multiple competitive bids. Finally, a quick word on optionality. Optionality in specifications and standards. An option provides additional flexibility to the contractor or vendor. It is supposed to make their lives simpler and our projects cheaper. Options are neither requirements nor recommendations, and in our industry, we use the word may to formally identify the permissible alternative. For example, the temporary living accommodation may be located on a flotel. Here's another example. The pilot burners may use fuel gas from the site. In these instances, we provide acceptable alternatives and leave it to the executing party to decide if that makes things easier. If they ignore these alternatives, then that's also okay, and we don't need any further discussion or formal deviation process. So that's the set. Shall, our requirements, which we covered in Part 1, and in Part 2, we just covered should and may, recommendations and options, respectively. All three mean completely different things, but please note, we still apply the same rules to each one. So we number each statement individually, and the same quality rules apply to recommendations and acceptable alternatives. In Part 3, the final part of this trilogy, we'll see how to avoid making common mistakes with these three simple words.